very much, Ben. So as Ben's already said, I'm Ben Parsons, just again to kind of introduce myself as well as introducing Chaucer. And as I've already mentioned, that's the whole purpose of this little talk, is to sort of introduce Chaucer and sort of walk you through his sort of background, the sort of period in which he was living, some of his work and his general career. In fact, I've sort of divided this talk into the following sections. That's sort of one of the images that have come down from us from the late Middle Ages that we believe is of Chaucer. That's from the famous Ellesmere manuscript of the Canterbury Tales. I quite like that image. You'll be seeing it quite a lot in this slideshow. So I suppose one of the big questions I'm kind of answering in the course of this talk is why study Chaucer. So why is he interesting? Why is his work? I mean, after all, the bulk of it written over 600 years ago now, 621 years ago and counting, in fact, even at the latest. Why is it we're still kind of talking about him and discussing him and sort of analysing his work and reading him on a regular basis? So I'm going to chop it into the following sections. So we'll look at Chaucer in his historical context. So looking at the sort of 14th century, both Chaucer's life and some of the kind of major events that sort of happened in the background of his life and the way that these kind of influenced or impacted on his work. We'll also be looking at Chaucer in medieval culture, so the way in which, again, some of those events, some of those larger kind of cultural shifts that are happening in the course of the 14th century impact themselves on his work and sort of nudge his poetry in various directions as he's working and composing it. We're going to look a lot at Chaucer and literary tradition as well. So the ways in which Chaucer is at this kind of real sort of turning point in terms of the types of outside forces that are influencing English and the sort of role he plays in formulating what we call literary tradition now in England as well, which is not quite the role that is sort of popularly attributed to him, but it's still quite important to sort of consider as a way of thinking about engaging with his works and the ways that he sort of asks us to engage with his works as well. I'll be talking a bit about kind of, what we think Chaucer did with the English literary tradition, actually sort of his own position as a writer, his own sort of, the way he thought of himself as a kind of poet and a composer of works. As I say, so that's going to be one of the kind of big headings as well as we move towards the end of the talk. So Chaucer's own kind of ideas on literature, his own ideas on what literature is for, how literature should be used and discussed and read and sort of appreciated, and the way in which his own work sort of represents these policies in action. And towards the end of the talk, hopefully there'll be enough time for me to kind of think about some of these things in sort of slightly less abstract terms and think about them in the sort of, focus them down on the Merchant's Tale in particular. So we can think about the ways in which all of the kind of information I'll be giving you can actually help you sort of understand how the Merchant's Tale is put together and how we can kind of appreciate and understand its kind of mechanisms and its mechanics. So to start off then with the top of those categories, Chaucer and his historical context, I'm going to walk you through Chaucer's biography, first of all, tell you kind of a few of the high points of his life in the latter half of the 14th century. And one of the first things to sort of stress is actually we know quite a lot about Chaucer. Chaucer, this is not something that is common to all medieval poets. I mean, two of Chaucer's kind of great contemporaries writing in English, William Langland, who wrote this kind of enormous sort of best-selling piece, Piers Plowman, just in the generation before Chaucer. We know virtually nothing about Langland at all, apart from his name. Likewise, one of Chaucer's other kind of really significant contemporaries, the author who wrote Gawain and the Green Knight, which is another kind of major Middle English work that's just this year been adapted for the screen. We don't even know the name of this guy. So it is not usual that we know kind of copious amounts of information about Chaucer, but we do indeed know copious amounts about him. We can actually plot his life in quite a lot of detail and know about his movements in his career, because there's a real kind of thick record has survived surrounding Chaucer and his activities. And this is largely a result of what those activities were in the circles that he moved in, as I'll tell you as we kind of move through the sort of the highlights. I mean, it's worth pointing out also, in fact, we know virtually nothing about Shakespeare, who's born kind of 200 years later. So we've got 500 individual records about Chaucer's life. As I say, it's quite a generous breadcrumb trail of facts kind of dotted around. Shakespeare, we know about kind of a dozen sort of points of reference from him: his will, the record of his birth in the parish register, and a few kind of dotted bits and pieces in between, but not so much. Only about 4% as many records of Shakespeare have survived as have survived for Chaucer. So as I say, we know quite a lot about Chaucer, the person, his movements, and sort of what he did with his life. The anthology Chaucer Life Records is over 600 pages long, quoting all the documents that we can piece together into his biography. So the biography looks like this. So he's born in 1342. More or less, that's the kind of date we can fix to that. His parents are John and Agnes Chaucer. In fact, before we kind of get into the sort of significance of that, I'm going to just say a bit about this birth date is kind of interesting in its own right, because it's a real sort of specimen of the types of record that we have of Chaucer. And again, it sort of shows why we do know quite so much about him as we do. We've been able to kind of conjecture that year of 1342 based on Chaucer's activity in what's called the Scrope-Grosvenor trial of 1385 to 90. So this was sort of quite a major court case in the sort of second to last decade of the 14th century between two of the sort of most powerful families in England. And it's one of these things that sounds quite kind of petty from several centuries distance, but actually was quite important for sort of medieval culture. So that these two families, the Scropes and the Grosvenors, basically they'd each laid claims to the same coat of arms. So that's that little image in the shield on the left there. And they were each using a very similar symbol, and the trial is really an attempt to work out who has the most claim to this kind of heraldic insignia. So it's the sort of thing that medieval culture gets very kind of exercised about, that looks kind of quite trivial to us. I mean, I suppose it is, to sort of give a kind of modern day parallel, it's kind of like sort of like identity theft more than anything. I mean, your heraldic device is a proclamation of your identity. So it's quite important to be, you know, you put it on everything you own, on your tomb, on your family estates, on your shield when you ride into battle, on your banners. So you do need to make sure that it is your property and yours alone. And in the course of this trial for the 5 years, Chaucer's name appears as a witness for the Grosvenors. So as you can see in that document there, Geoffrey Chaucer identifies himself as being of the age of 40 years and more, armed for 27 years. So we can work out from that date, working backwards for those 40 years, that he's probably born about 1342. As I say, this is sort of very representative of the type of records that we find about Chaucer. They often tend to be associated with the law, with bureaucracy, because this is exactly the circles that Chaucer moves in. He is occupying that kind of legalistic, bureaucratic kind of sphere of medieval society on the fringes of the royal court. So it's no surprise that this is sort of, you know, one of the key documents comes from a legal case that allows us to work out at least roughly when Chaucer is born. So to go back to the timeline. So he's born to John and Agnes Chaucer. And the role of John Chaucer is again sort of quite significant. So John is a vintner, and a vintner is a seller of wine. So this doesn't mean that he runs like the medieval equivalent of an off license. He's actually quite a wealthy importer and exporter of wine. So he buys in wine from Europe, from the continent, and from the great wine producing regions around the Rhine Valley, and imports into England. At this point, bear in mind, this is a point in history at which there is no access to clean tap water. So drinking alcoholic drinks is actually the equivalent to drinking tea and coffee in this period. In fact, it's before the discovery of the New World, of course. So coffee and tea is kind of out of the question likewise. So wine is drunk far more regularly and far more routinely in medieval England than it is at any other point. So, you know, this is quite a sort of significant role. This isn't just a kind of a luxury good that John imports. It's something that everyone would be using very regularly. But what it does show is that Chaucer from the first is not part of the nobility. So he's part of the middle class, as we call it. So John is a tradesman. He's not a lord, he's not an earl, he's not a duke, he's not a kind of high-ranking member of medieval society. He's wealthy, he has international connections and even royal connections. He's one of his customers is Edward III, it appears. But he's not noble himself, and Chaucer is kind of very aware of this. Chaucer belongs to this kind of middle stratum of medieval society, you know, well-to-do, wealthy, owning property, but not actually noble, but not actually kind of breaking into the aristocratic upper level of society. And Chaucer is very aware of his kind of intermediate position, and it's something you find kind of filtering through a lot of his work, be it the fact that he belongs to this middle class, this middle ranking zone of medieval society. However, this is also a very mobile society that Chaucer kind of moves in. So as a result of his father's kind of connections, he attaches himself fairly early on to the household of Countess Elizabeth of Ulster. So he's able to sort of, even though he's not able to kind of penetrate sort of noble quarters himself, he doesn't ever become noble, he's still able to sort of attach himself to the fringes of not a royal court, but a countess's court at Ulster from the 1350s. He eventually sees kind of military service, which is kind of normal for a young man of his age in wars in France, serving as an esquire, not very well. By 1360, he's apparently been captured by the French and he's ransomed by Edward III. His name appears in a list of knights and squires who have been paid by Edward III in order to be released back into England. In 1366, his connections bring him a wife, so he marries Philippa de Rut, who's much more highly ranking in the social order than he is. She's lady-in-waiting to Philippa of Hainault, who is the wife of, of Edward III, and they're supposed to be married at Leicester. So in this, the site of their marriage is traditionally thought to be the Church of St Mary de Castro in Leicester, which appears on the image there. Because I teach at Leicester, so it's a kind of a bit of local colour and connection to brag about. Eventually, they have their first son, Thomas, who continues his father's kind of social progression. He enters the sort of household of Henry IV in the early 15th century and eventually becomes Speaker of the House of Parliament and has quite a sort of prestigious political career. In the 1360s, the late 1360s and 70s, Chaucer then starts to engage in some sort of what seemed to be kind of diplomatic, possibly even kind of shady sort of spy dealings overseas. So a lot of records refer to him being overseas on the king's service. It's all very kind of hush-hush, all very secretive. It's not clear what he's kind of doing overseas. Sometimes he seems to be kind of brokering marriages for sort of the young Richard II when he's kind of over in Italy, but it seems to be, you know, casting his net more widely in the 1360s and 70s. He joins John of Gaunt in his French campaigns, again sees kind of military service overseas. Again, he becomes a diplomatic envoy in Genoa and Florence. These are kind of city-states in what would eventually become Italy. This is actually quite an important period of his life, the 1370s, the fact that he goes over to Italy. What he's doing there seems to be to broker a marriage between the young, who will become Richard II, and some of the kind of major noble families in Italy. But as I say, as I'll kind of go on to say, this sort of period is quite a turning point for Chaucer when he actually goes over to Italy, and his kind of experiences there seem to be kind of reflected quite profoundly and deeply in his writing. In the rest of for most of the 1370s and 80s, however, he kind of settles into something of a kind of a bureaucratic rut. So he gets a job comptroller of customs, which is quite a kind of quite a heavy role in terms of responsibility. So he's kind of overseeing everything that comes in and goes out of London. He's basically sort of, you know, dealing with merchants and traders on a regular basis. He's given an apartment in Aldgate, which is sort of a gate set in the wall of old medieval London. There's a kind of woodcut of what it looked like in the 18th century. He lives there for most of his kind of later adult life. Again, he gets involved in marriage negotiations in the part of the 1370s. It allows him to go back to Italy. He has a second son, Louis. He becomes another kind of high-ranking position in the later part of the 1380s. He becomes something like a magistrate, a justice of the peace, and a knight of shire, which means he's basically like a member of parliament. His wife dies. He becomes clerk of works for the final decade of his life, which means he oversees Richard II's building projects. He's responsible for bankrolling, or at least kind of overseeing the side of finances for all the kind of major, as I say, building projects that the king kind of undertakes for that period. As a result of this activity, riding around the country, he gets kind of robbed and assaulted on a fairly regular basis. In 1390, he's particularly upset when Richard Braley attacks him at Hatcham and steals his horse at a place called the Foul Oak. In 1399, perhaps in recognition that the shadows are lengthening and the end of his life is drawing near, he leases a plot of ground in Westminster Abbey, and then he dies in October 1400, just the same year, well, roughly a year after Richard II's been deposed by Henry IV, and the traditional date given of his death, as you can see on his tombstone there from Westminster Abbey, is 25th of October, and you know that's him kind of wrapped up. So he lives quite a busy, quite an active life, largely in the sort of royal service as a kind of servant, as a bureaucrat. Both in formalized roles, but also kind of going abroad on the service of the king in order to help out kind of diplomatic missions. So it's a series of roles that give him lots of opportunity to kind of travel and meeting people and encountering people both around England and on the continent. But you'll notice something that is very absent from these records, and that's any sense of Chaucer as a poet. And that's, again, something that is quite kind of striking when you look through the Chaucer life records, that they make absolutely no mention of Chaucer's writing at all. There's nothing referring to him writing anything for the king, whether it be Edward III or Richard II. There's nothing referring to him receiving any payment for his writing, for any kind of let alone the king, of any kind of his noble contracts. It seems as if Chaucer almost has kind of two parallel careers. On the one hand, his kind of professional life as a bureaucrat. On the other hand, his own sort of productions as a poet. And in fact, actually, he's kind of aware of this himself. In one of his sort of earlier works that predates the Canterbury Tales, The House of Fame, which is this kind of wonderfully sort of self-conscious piece of work in which Chaucer inserts himself into the text as a character in much the same way as he will do in the Canterbury Tales later on. He is accosted by an eagle that sort of accuses him of not living his life to the fullest, if you like, and sort of it tells him, "Thou goest home to thy house, and also dumb as any stone. Thou sittest at another book, till fully dozed, fully dazed is thy look, and livest thus as a hermit." So Chaucer's almost kind of self-consciously recognizing there that he kind of works all day and writes all night. Thou sittest at another book. So he sits doing accounts during the day as comptroller of customs. He goes home and all he does is kind of pore over another book. He's almost kind of acknowledging he's got kind of two parallel lives running side by side. But this is the point, really, that he's not a kind of professional poet in any sense at all. His professional life is spent doing other things. His poetry is written in his own time for his own amusement and for the amusement of his friends. And we'll talk a bit about the implications of that later on. But in terms of that literary career, it's kind of an interesting one, and you can see there are kind of very clear turning points. So this is a kind of summary of some of the major work that he produced. So he's sort of writing probably from about his mid-20s. He starts producing work regularly. His early work is material like an ABC, which is very pious. It's really a kind of prayer organized under the different letters of the alphabet. The Roman de la Rose he works on in the 1360s, the Book of the Duchess, and then eventually, as we'll see, from about the kind of 1380s, we start getting the kind of the mature Chaucerian works, the ones that people have heard of. So things like the Canterbury Tales, Troilus and Crusade, and finally, the final piece of work we have by him is this complaint of Chaucer to his purse. Now, all of those titles probably don't mean anything at first glance, but they can be divided into some kind of interesting sort of fields, and they show again Chaucer picking up on different kind of currents, different sort of forms of information as he works his way through his life. So the earliest phase of Chaucer's work is very dependent on French. French is, of course, the dominant literary, legal, and noble language at this point. So it is the language of the aristocracy still. Apparently, Edward III could only really swear effectively in English. He conducted his business as king in French. So Chaucer kind of he sort of responds to this in that most of his major work, it tends to be kind of translations or adaptations from French sources. So an ABC is a direct translation, well, a simplified translation of Le Pèlerinage de la vie humaine, which translates to the pilgrimage of the life of man. The Roman de la Rose, or the Romaunt of the Rose in Chaucer's version, is also a translation of a longer French work by Guillaume de Loris and Jean de Meun, written in the 13th century. The Book of the Duchess is a kind of complex work. It's very composite, but it is mostly built up, again, out of translations, largely of French works by Guy Marchot and Jean Froissart. However, in the 1370s, when he's sent on these diplomatic missions, particularly to Italy, he starts to pick up on kind of new currents instead, particularly when he goes to Florence and Genoa in the 1370s in the service of Richard II. And from this point, he starts to pick up on new kind of sets of influences. So the three particular figures that are very important to him at this point that he may have met the two younger men here are Dante Alighieri, the writer of principally the Divine Comedy, this kind of wonderful description of a journey taken through hell, purgatory, and heaven that Dante recounts, and particularly the hell section, or Inferno, as it's called in the Italian, has this very picturesque description of all the very elaborate punishments given to the different varieties of sinner as Dante kind of progresses through the circles. But Chaucer would not have met Dante because Dante died in the 1320s, but certainly when he's in Italy, he's able to kind of acquaint himself with the works of this man. The two figures that were kind of important while he's there are Giovanni Boccaccio, the writer of the Decameron, and one of the figures responsible for popularizing the study of Dante as well, and Francesco Petrarca, who is, again, a kind of experimental poet. I mean, these three figures they represent probably what we call the kind of the earliest stirrings of humanism, paving the way for the Renaissance a few centuries later, or the literary Renaissance anyway, in that they're very interested in classical learning, classical literature. So Chaucer is kind of his voyage to Italy lets him kind of plug into the kind of ground zero, if you like, from which the foundations of the Renaissance are starting to bubble up through the work of these three figures. And it's Giovanni Boccaccio that proves to be the most influential on Chaucer. So Chaucer then shifts his attention from the 1370s, and you can see this shift immediately as he starts to get fired up. His imagination is kind of put into overdrive by these new Italian works instead. So the Teseida by Boccaccio is very influential in that it's what he uses for Annaleda and Arcite in 1375. The House of Fame draws on Dante, and Troilus and Cressida is also drawn from Boccaccio as well, kind of later on in the 1380s. And these are figures that Chaucer kind of keeps coming back to again and again throughout his sort of, this is the reading that really kind of, as I say, starts the pistons firing on his own imagination. So that's Chaucer the man, Chaucer the poet. I'm going to talk a bit about the sort of historical background of Chaucer, but mainly I'm going to kind of try and focus on the events here that feed into Chaucer's work. I mean, what's kind of interesting about Chaucer and the way that he does respond to the culture, to the world he inhabits, is that he is a very intensely literary writer, in that he's not necessarily interested in the real world, if that makes sense. What he is interested in is the way the real world is presented through texts. So quite often when he does pick up on sort of historical background, historical context, what we could call it, he doesn't tend to sort of present it in the most direct way. He's not a sort of, he's not a chronicler of the late Middle Ages. What he's more interested in is kind of thinking about the fictions, the myths that kind of develop around particular events and kind of exploring those as kind of objects of interest in their own right. But there's still no denying that he did live through some, you know, as the old cliche goes, quote unquote turbulent times. So the late 14th century, when he's alive, is one that is kind of very rocky, very kind of unstable, and sort of and oddly resonant with some of the instability that we've seen in our own lives very recently as well, of course. So one of the kind of big events that hangs over the late 14th century is the 100 Years' War between England and France. Actually lasts a lot longer than 100 years if you do the maths on that, or a lot less because it is suspended during the reign of Richard II from 1377 to 1399. But it is this kind of, you know, this contest between England and France for ownership of France. That's sort of, you know, a question that's left open sort of in 1337. It starts from Edward III sort of pressing home his claim to French territories, and the wars are kind of fought very bitterly up until the 1450s. Another kind of major event that sort of starts to sort of rumble away when Chaucer is about 6, certainly in his own lifetime, is the arrival of the Black Death in England, of course. First makes landfall at Weymouth in Dorset, and very quickly lays waste to large amounts of the country. So urban centres like London and York and Bristol are extremely badly hit. So London loses anywhere between half and 2/3 of its adult population in the space of 4 years from 1348. It doesn't go away either. It comes back in the 1360s and back again in the 1380s as well. So this is a hugely kind of apocalyptic event, which sort of rolls across Europe really and sort of claims a huge number of casualties. We have also, of course, the reign of Richard II, which is a very kind of troubled reign. Richard II is not an effective king. He's also the wagon to whom Chaucer has hitched himself. So a lot of the kind of the challenges that Richard faces in his reign are also challenges that affect Chaucer's own stability as a man and a writer. We've also got kind of various other sort of religious tensions as well. So there's the emergence of this heretical group who want to read the Bible in English. Now, dreadful, kind of unthinkable idea called the Lollards or the Wycliffites that sort of begin from the 1370s. We've also got kind of a period known as the Great Schism, when there are actually 2 popes, each sort of with rival claims to the papacy, and each pope names a successor, so it kind of rumbles on for kind of generations beyond that. So, you know, the Catholic Church, which should really be supplying kind of ideological sort of stability and cohesion to medieval culture, is actually split in 2, and there are these other kind of dissident sort of groups appearing to sort of challenge the authority of the papacy and the traditional teachings of the church. In 1381, we have a full-scale revolution in the form of the Peasants' Revolt. 1388, we have Richard II, his household is put on trial and he's forced to put many of them to death. And finally, Richard II is kind of forced to abdicate in 1399 and starve to death. So as I say, it's a very turbulent period Chaucer lives through. Politically, religiously, you know, it has revolutions, it has epidemics, it has, you know, a lot of open warfare. It has a lot of chaos kind of rumbling on in the margins. It's Chaucer, the way that you respond to these things is not always kind of predictable. So, for instance, the fact that shadow of warfare, international war, is kind of hanging over his adult life is something he processes in sort of quite odd ways. He's very interested in knighthood and chivalry, and often depicts knights as characters. So, for instance, in the Knight's Tale, which is the first story in the Canterbury Tales sequence, he spends a lot of ink talking about chivalry, the art of being a knight. And he's really kind of interested in the kind of glamour of knighthood, if you like. So, for instance, this is his description of a tournament between two sets of knights. 100 lords had he with him there, all armed, save their heads, in all their gears. They're not wearing helmets, so everyone can see what they look like as they're riding through this arena. In all their gear, full richly in all manner things, for trusteth well that dukes, earls, kings were gathered in this noble company, for love and for increase of chivalry. As you can see, very interested in chivalry as like a positive force, something glamorous, something spectacular. But he's also, at the same time, aware of the violence of knighthood. So as well as seeing it as being something beautiful and spectacular, it's also something ugly and upsetting. So this is how he describes in the same story a temple that's been raised to Mars, the god of war. There stood the temple of Mars, armipotent. There saw I first the dark imagining, the treason of the murdering in the bed, the open war with the wounds all bebled, all bloody, the carrion in the busk with throat carved, 1,000 slain and not of qualm it starved, the tyrant with the prey by force eraft, the town destroyed, there was nothing left. So as you can see, it's a very kind of, when he's imagining a temple and the scenes painted on the walls of this temple, dedicated to Mars, it's a very bleak picture full of violence and turbulence. So, as I say, he's a very kind of ambivalent poet when it comes to knighthood. And again, this is probably due to that middle class social position he inhabits, the fact that he's not he's desirous of entering the kind of knightly noble order, but also aware that he's outside it, that it's not something that is part of his world and can therefore see it kind of quite critically as well as with a degree of interest. There's also, of course, the way he responds to the Black Death. So I mentioned the Black Death being this kind of momentous, costly sort of event, and this is a kind of quick overview of what the plague was like from Henry Knighton's Chronicon from 1395. As he says, it penetrated the seacoast and Southampton and came to Bristol. Almost the whole population of the town perished as it had been seized by a sudden death. This cruel death spread everywhere around, following the course of the sun. There died at Leicester in every parish a great multitude. And he goes on to talk about how cities are kind of collapsing through lack of habitation. There are so many dead people that it feels like the fabric of society is kind of coming apart. The architecture is falling to pieces. But Chaucer doesn't respond to this as kind of we might expect him to. This is the quote about the Peasants' Revolt. I mean, so again, another kind of those momentous events that he lives through, the Peasants' Revolt. He doesn't talk about the Peasants' Revolt as as something frightening, as something terrifying, a kind of collapse of the social order. For him, he treats it more like a joke. So when he does refer to the Peasants' Revolt, he compares it to a farmyard chasing after a fox in the Nun's Priest's Tale. So he says, the ducks cried as men would them kill, for geese for fear flown over the trees. Out of the hive came a swarm of bees, so hideous was the noise, benedicti. Certes never jackstraw with his mene, made never shouts half so shrill, when they would any Fleming kill. So jackstraw is one of the leaders of the Peasants' Revolt, and here Chaucer just compares it to animals running amok in a farmyard, as if it is kind of something comic, something kind of Disney-like and sort of funny. On the Black Death, this is what he has to say. Again, he uses one of the most famous engagements of the Black Death, or his most sustained engagements, is the Pardoner's Tale, where it provides this kind of very dark background against which the story, which is about 3 men who set out to kill death. And he describes the sort of the scenes of carnage in the kind of countryside in the following way. There came a privy thief, men clepeth death, that in this country all the people slayeth. And with his spear he smote his heart at 2, and went his way withouten words more. He hath 1,000 slain this pestilence, hence over a mile within a great village, both men and women, child and hind and page. So again, it's not, he uses the Black Death not as something just to depict, not as a historical event he's lived through, but again, it's more like a literary resource. It's something he's using to conjure a particular mood. Again, he's not, it's worth stressing once again, he's not a kind of historical poet. He's not a poet that is talking directly about the world he inhabited. What he's interested in is the literary sort of structures that we use to make sense of that world. So even when he talks about kind of historical events he's lived through, like the Peasants' Revolt, like the Black Death, like warfare, what he's interested in is the sort of the narratives that have been built around these things. That's where his focus is trained on. His first point of reference is always literature. He's a parodist. He's almost kind of like a critic as much as he is a poet, and that he's always talking about the way other people talk about these things. So even when he talks about the Black Death, it's about personifying death. It's about using death as a character and then kind of colouring the background of this story. Okay, so I want to move on now and think about Chaucer in English literature. I've already said a bit about Chaucer as a very intensely literary writer. And this is itself another sort of interesting story or an interesting aspect of thinking and engaging with Chaucer. So there's no denying, of course, that Chaucer, as the graphic, very kind of literally is designed to show, casts a long shadow over writing in English that follows. He is, for at least 2 centuries after he's died, the dominant poetic model. Every writer writing in the 15th and 16th century looks back to Chaucer to imitate, to work through. You know, he's the kind of template, he's the prototype, he is the standard of kind of good writing in English that all writers kind of engage with. No less a figure than Shakespeare is driven to sort of engage with them at various points. Even though Shakespeare is a dramatist, not a poet, he's still driven to sort of think about Chaucer's work and adapt Chaucer's work and make use of Chaucer's work and engage with Chaucer's work. So the Knight's Tale becomes the kind of foundation of Two Noble Kinsmen, one of Shakespeare's later plays. Troilus and Cresside is the foundation of Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida. And elsewhere in plays like The Tempest and The Taming of the Shrew, he borrows figures or devices from the Franklin's Tale, The Wife of Bath, and lots of other ones that are too numerous to sort of delineate on a slide here. Even further down the track, 17th and 18th centuries, you've got figures like Dryden, Pope, and the dramatist John Gay, again adapting Chaucer's work in a very kind of self-conscious way. In the 19th century, it was Sir Walter Scott, William Blake, John Keats, William Wordsworth, Rudyard Kipling, all kind of deliberately rewrite his work, again look back to his work, sort of make use of his kind of fictions. And then in the 20th and 21st century, this continues. So J.K. Rowling rewrites The Pardoner's Tale in the story of the Deathly Hallows. She's even acknowledged that, so I'm not accusing her of plagiarising. Neil Gaiman makes use of the Canterbury Tales and the Sandman series. George R.R. Martin has got loads of bits of Chaucer scattered throughout the whole of the Game of Thrones sort of sequence. So again, you know, he's very much, you know, as I say, he's cast a long shadow. He is a figure that is still being used as a kind of literary resource, revisited and reworked. Now, this, as a kind of part of this, you'll find that you've probably heard of the idea of Chaucer being the father of English literature, which is the kind of what I'm trying to sort of show in that graphic there. And this is, as I say, a myth that has some justification, given that he has been used so sort of roundly from the point of his death forward, but also sort of is slightly misleading in that it sort of steers us away from actually engaging with Chaucer as he wanted to be engaged with in his own work, or actually accurately thinking about how he works. So the idea of Chaucer as father of English literature is first put forward in that form by John Dryden in 1700. So he says, I say something of Chaucer in particular. Here, in the first place, he is father of English poetry, just like Homer is father of Greek poetry. And once Dryden set up that formula, you find other figures later on, like Matthew Arnold, Samuel Johnson, Alexander Pope, who are the other 3 guys there. They also sort of echo this idea of Chaucer as father of English literature. And he, in fact, it even becomes a kind of cliche within a decade or so of Chaucer dying. So Thomas Hoccleve, who may have known Chaucer, also talks about Chaucer as father. So master dear and father reverent, as he says, my master Chaucer, flower of eloquence. I'm not going to read any more because Hockley is not a very good poet. But as you can see, this idea of Chaucer as master, teacher, father, the sort of, the instigator of the English tradition. Now, as I say, this is not actually something that maps very neatly onto how Chaucer would have thought of himself as a writer. As John Burrow puts there, Chaucer's own conception of literary tradition suggests that he thought of himself not as an heir, as someone who used other people's work, not as someone who kind of started anything new. And in fact, at the end of the Canterbury Tales, he talks of himself, his own works, as translations, inditings. Translations meaning, he's adapted from other sources. Inditings does mean kind of inventions, but again, not invented from nothing. So Chaucer doesn't see himself as as the origin of anything. He is kind of picking up on stuff he's sort of encountered elsewhere and reusing and repurposing it. And in fact, this is something that flows throughout his work. So the Canterbury Tales is very, very self-conscious in this. And of course, this is, what you are sort of studying, at least in part at this point. So the Canterbury Tales is, Chaucer's, throughout the tales, he's kind of experimenting with genre. As he moves, each of the pilgrims that tell the stories also tell a particular specimen of a type of genre in medieval literature. So the knight talks, his story is based in the kind of the genre of classical romance. Then we get the kind of fablio, this kind of rather comic, often quite bawdy form of writing that's emanated from France. We've got hagiographies or saints' lives later on, Arthurian romances, novellas. And basically the point is that Chaucer is very, as I say, self-consciously bringing different genres together, hopping between different types of writing. Again, he's not talking about the real world he inhabits. He's talking about the literary frameworks that have been erected to understand that world. And the whole point in the Canterbury Pilgrimage is not to talk about real people in the real 14th century, but to talk about stories and the types of stories, the social conflict he creates around the pilgrims is really a literary conflict between different genres or types of writing. This is also reflected in the kind of meters he uses for those tales, the fact that a lot of them, he jumps between couplets and rhyme royals. So, these are, again, types of verse that are appropriate to the types of writing he uses. So it makes that kind of transition between different types of writing even more pronounced as he moves between different types of verse. I'll make this the kind of final point before I kind of wrap up, because I'm aware that the time is going forward. And the other thing that this sort of implies also is that, that Chaucer really wants us to kind of look at his work as a kind of puzzle, to kind of think about his work as something that is a challenge to our understanding that needs to be talked about and worked through. Again, he doesn't see himself as that label father of English literature would imply, as a figure that kind of radiates authority, that sort of is telling us something we have to listen to, and that's the end of it. He's not a kind of delivering his literature like a sermon. If anything, he's delivering a kind of puzzle that he asks us to engage with. And you kind of see this in this image I put on here. As I say, I'll make this the kind of final thing I point out. But this is an image from a manuscript of Troilus and Cresside, compiled in about a couple of decades after Chaucer's death. And what's kind of striking about this, so Chaucer's the guy in the middle there at the lectern reading out his latest work, and the audience around him are of course listening, but a lot of them listening attentively. So you've got a man there sort of resting his chin on his hand to sort of pay full attention, but also you've got other figures who are not really paying that much attention to Chaucer at all. They're chatting amongst themselves, they're talking to each other. So the point is that Chaucer's work, as Mary Carruthers says here in this quote, is sociable. It's not designed just to be kind of read and, sort of unwrapped like a sweet for its kind of single meaning. Chaucer wants his work to be discussed and debated and sort of puzzled out and worked through. Chaucer's work comes to life as we read it. It's not something that's kind of deep frozen. And quite often he kind of he drives the readers to engage with it in these ways. So he's a devil for kind of asking sort of questions in his stories, for instance, or posing problems in his stories. I mean, there are problems that are kind of embedded in his writing. As I say, his writing is part of this culture which is which treats text in a very kind of interactive way. And Chaucer plays into this. Chaucer is kind of setting as a kind of riddle, a series of kind of puzzle pieces he wants us to kind of make sense of, rather than, as that myth of father of English literature would suggest, something that kind of contains a single authoritative meaning to be unpacked. Chaucer's work is all about debate, and it's written for an audience that's clearly, as that image shows, used to debate and used to kind of asking each other questions and discussing stories. Okay, thank you for attention there. As I say, I'll wrap things up at that point.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Is there any questions anyone wants to ask? We've got about 5 more minutes. Do feel free to put your mic on if you want to ask, or just put something there in the chat.
What I will do, I mean, I will, if anyone does have any questions for me afterwards, do feel free to use my email. Or likewise, if you want a copy of the PowerPoint, by all means, do get in touch and I'll send one through for you. So I'll just put my email in the chat there. So if anyone does want to get in touch for either of those 2 reasons, as I say, to ask any questions or to get a copy of the document itself, then please do feel free to get in contact.
Okay, there's a question here.
Mm-hmm.
A question here from North. His question is, in works of art like that, how do we identify Chaucer?
Oh, I see what you mean. How do we know that it's Chaucer in an image? Well, in that case, usually they're quite explicit in the manuscripts themselves. Again, I suppose the fact that we have images in manuscripts kind of underscores that point I was making about the fact that medieval culture likes to engage and think about stories. Stories are not just kind of, as I say, these things unfold authoritatively. They are puzzles to be kind of worked through. I mean, the Merchant's Tale is kind of itself a kind of example of that. And the fact that we do find pictures in manuscripts quite regularly, I think this is sort of part of that. It's kind of inviting the reader to kind of visualize different sorts of details and sort of, you know, piece together the text and the image as it goes side by side. So usually the manuscripts will tell us that this is Chaucer. So the portrait of Chaucer from the Ellesmere Canterbury Tales, for instance, is put next to Chaucer's story, The Tale of Mellabay. It's one of the stories that the Chaucer character delivers in the course of the Canterbury Tales. So it's kind of, you know, it makes it clear that that is Chaucer. There's another portrait as well, which is from a kind of a poem by Thomas Hoccleve, one of the sort of, you know, followers of Chaucer, where the Chaucer figure is kind of pointing at his own name. So his finger is kind of, you know, pressed quite close to his own name as well. So that, I mean, that's kind of how we do know that they are Chaucer, because the manuscripts will give us clues to kind of tell us that this is the figure that's being depicted there. I don't know if that's any sort of answer to the question, or if it maybe raised more questions at all. I suppose one of the things that is interesting is that none of the pictures of Chaucer look anything like each other. So they're clearly kind of a bit of artistic license on behalf of the artist. Then if you compare them, they often look like completely different people, unless they are based directly on each other. So again, they're not portraits from life. They are kind of approximate ideas of what Chaucer might have looked like, sort of painted later on.
Okay, we have probably time for about one more question.
Yep.
Anyone has something to ask? As I said, you can feel free to contact Ben. He's given you your email contact there. Some of you I know might obviously prefer to do that outside of a kind of group forum, which is completely understandable. Yeah.
If anything kind of occurs to you, sort of, I know what it's like. Sort of, you know, days, hours later on, suddenly you kind of crystallize and you think, I've missed a chance. But please do, as I say, make use of my email there, and I'll. And likewise, if you do want a copy of those slides, I'm happy to send those through.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that, Ben, today, and thank you for all attending today. And hopefully see you all soon on the next program or the next masterclass. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for your attention. Good to speak to you all.
Thanks, Ben. Again, bye.
Thanks.